Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the European Conservatives podcast, Brussels and Beyond, a podcast designed to keep you in the loop about the political wheelings and dealings that are happening here in Brussels and in the capitals of Europe. My name is Zoltán Kottas. The case of a schoolgirl who was questioned by police officers in her school has caused a huge uproar in Germany. 16-year-old Loretta was recently removed from class and questioned by police for expressing support for the anti-immigration, anti-globalist AfD party and posting right-wing content online. In an interview for German publication Junge Freiheit, also translated and published on our website, Loretta explained how the police officers told her that she had shown too much national pride on social media site TikTok and that she should not address her political opinion on the internet. As Loretta's mother told Junge Freiheit, it was the school's headmaster who informed the police, acting on an instruction of the Ministry of Education in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. The ministry has instructed schools to inform the police in so-called suspected cases to have the students checked for right-wing extremist anti-constitutional content. Parents, however, are not informed of such an investigation. The story about the 16-year-old student has been dominating headlines in Germany. Beatrix von Storch, deputy chairwoman of the AfD parliamentary group, filed a complaint against the headmaster of the school on suspicion of false suspicion, coercion, and all other possible criminal offences. Multiple German state interior ministers from establishment parties, who for years denied the link between mass migration and increased crime, have now acknowledged the connection. According to Bavaria's latest crime statistics, non-German citizens living in Bavaria comprised 39.6% of criminal suspects in 2023, despite making up only 16% of the population. Bavaria has witnessed a 20.5% uptick in the total number of immigrants suspected of having committed crimes. The criminal statistics make it clear that uncontrolled immigration negatively impacts the security situation, Interior Minister Joachim Herrmann said. North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany's most populous state, also recorded a drastic year-over-year spike in the proportion of migrant criminal suspects. Migrants, who make up some 17.5% of the state's total population, were drastically overrepresented as criminal suspects, as 35% of suspects did not have German passports. This represents a jump of 10% compared to the previous year. The numbers tell us that we haven't done our homework when it comes to integration, Interior Minister Herbert Reul said. French senators have published a report that expresses alarm at the excesses of child gender transition and have proposed a bill to put an end to it. A lengthy investigation initiated by a centre-right senator has just been made public. The report points to a number of abuses by health professionals, and the authors of the report accuse trans activist associations of unreasonably encouraging gender transition in minors via an intense propaganda campaign on social media. Although statistics are lacking in France, the doctors consulted as part of the parliamentary inquiry report a dramatic increase in requests for gender reassignment, including among very young children. One professor said that 16% of his patients who were minors were under the age of 12. Other acclaimed psychologists say that the overwhelming majority of children treated for so-called gender dysphoria are victims of other disorders. Sex reassignment is proposed to many children battling depression as the solution to their problems, without any attempts to explore other ways of overcoming their mental health issues. Senators, believing that the danger is palpable, want to propose a bill before the summer to prohibit any medical gender transition before the age of 18 in France. The aim would be to prevent doctors from administering puberty blockers and cross-reactive hormones, followed by sex reassignment surgery to minors being treated for gender dysphoria. The European Conservative held a panel discussion in Brussels on Wednesday on the subject of the upcoming EU elections in June to discuss what is actually at stake. There has been talk of a right-wing surge in the European Parliament and a shift of balance in power following populist successes in the Netherlands, Ireland and Portugal. One of the panelists, Peter Klepper, editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu, argued that the European Parliament, the politicians in the Brussels bubble, are immune to the hardships of ordinary people.
If you look at the current European Parliament, they seem completely immune for all the protests from farmers, the protests from industry against the European green policies. They only in the last month they voted for the nature restoration law, for sharper emission targets, even for mandatory building renovation, which according to the Italian government is simply something that both governments and citizens cannot afford. And I think if you keep your pulse a little bit with society anywhere in Europe, people are complaining about higher and higher rents, higher and higher construction, building prices, even here in Brussels, which is traditionally relatively cheap for a big city. None of this seems to penetrate the bubble of the European Parliament. That's why we need some kind of an upset.
Dora Peter Francescu, a research expert and CEO and founder of EUmatrix.eu, argued that the rise of populist parties was not necessarily due to an increase of Eurosceptic sentiment in the EU, but because the trust in national political leaders has gone down.
But indeed, the system moves more to the right. And why is that? It's not necessarily due to an increase, if you look at the numbers, it's not necessarily due to an increase of the anti-European or Eurosceptic sentiment across the EU, because at least according to the data that we're having from the Eurobarometer, the trust in the EU has been stable over the past 10 years, in some countries even going up, even in countries like Poland and Hungary. What happens is that the trust in the political leaders in these countries has gone down substantially. It is much harder now to govern national countries in Europe than it was before. If you are a political leader, prime minister or president, you are becoming unpopular much faster than before. And the governments are weaker. They are less stable. They change much faster than before. This is what happened over the past decade for a number of reasons, including a certain level of frustration or cumulative frustration over a very long period of time since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. If you look at the data, the economic optimism index, it has almost continuously been on the negative, people being pessimistic about where the economy and the society is going.
James Holland, a political consultant who has worked in the EU bubble for 15 years, said that because of a potential shift to the right in the European Parliament, there may be enough Eurosceptic parties to launch inquiries about policies that have been mismanaged by the European Commission.
But I think that because we get to this point where there is enough Eurosceptic parties in the non-ASCII, in ID, in ECR, also in the far left, you get to a point where if you can hit about 180, 190 MEPs, you can start to call for committees of inquiry, for example. That's something that's been generally used in the European Parliament as something to follow crises, LuxLeaks, Panama Papers, things like this. But we get to the point now where you'll have enough MEPs, and you need 3 political groups and about 180 MEPs to ask the Conference of Presidents in the European Parliament to inquire on a specific policy aspect. But here you could start to bring into question the common agricultural policy. You could start talking about specific policy and say, we've mismanaged this, there's crises, there's inflation in prices, there's uncertainty for industry. And to actually grill specific commissioners in the Parliament, highly mediatized event, where you can grill them more than you would normally be able to. Now, the reason why this hasn't worked in the past, just to finish, is that generally we have this grand coalition that dominates the 3 institutions. The 3 big groups dominate all 3 institutions. The way you can get out of that is by having that share of the vote drop to a certain point where all the opposition groups can get together and force the Renew Energy Commissioner, the Socialist Labour Commissioner, the EPP Energy Commissioner, to all sit down and answer questions about how this policy wasn't done well and how are you going to improve your performance in the next 5 years.
Frank Furedi, Executive Director of MCC Brussels, said populism is the beneficiary of the process of mainstream parties and Eurocrats losing their legitimacy.
But this is the year when things have really kind of kicked in. Now, populism is to some extent the beneficiary of this. It's not all about its internal dynamic, its internal history, it's benefited from the fact that the Eurocrats, both nationally and within Brussels, have lost a lot of ground, at least in terms of authority and legitimacy. And therefore, I think we need to understand that whatever happens with the EPP is, to some extent, no longer as important as it used to be. I mean, Ursula might be the princess of Europe, but in the real world, Ursula would never get elected to anything other than a parish councillor, sort of in Bavaria, right? So it's quite important to realize what's really happening here. And as a result of that, I am very optimistic, because I think that what's really happening now is that people are waking up. It doesn't necessarily simply take a Eurosceptic form, because a lot of people hope that Europe is better than the national government. It's a contradictory kind of process. But nevertheless, what you have is an intensification of the suspicion and the alienation, estrangement from the mainstream. So that's a very important process.
My colleague Mick Hume, author of the Democracy Watch column for the European Conservative, has written extensively about the rise of populism and its causes. Mick, we are just over 2 months away from the European elections, and anti-establishment, anti-globalist, or in other words, populist parties all around Europe are set to become stronger. What is driving this trend?
Zoltan, I think we should recognise how big and important this populist revolt is. In something I'm just writing now, I'm describing it as another European spring of nations, or people's spring. That's how they described the democratic national revolutions of 1848. And we're close to something similar now in terms of a revolt against the increasing centralised power in the EU in the hands of bureaucrats and officials and the big players in Brussels. I think the fact that the populist party that broke through in the recent Portuguese elections was called Chega, enough, kind of sums it up really. People are just saying we've had enough of the old political elites, of the establishment, of their high-minded green policies and pro-migration policies, which are destroying the European way of life for millions of ordinary Europeans. So it's a very, very significant uprising we're seeing, and you can see the terror, the fear it's causing in the eyes of the political establishment, the way that they're attempting to denigrate and isolate it by making populism a dirty word, by saying everything is far right. The farmers' protests are being manipulated by the far right. It couldn't just be that ordinary people are so angry they've had enough of this. It's got to be something politically dangerous, a virus. They talk about populism that needs to be we need to be vaccinated against, and that needs to be isolated. So you can see from their reaction and how afraid they are of it, how important it is. And I think it's something that anybody who wants to, like us, who wants to defend democracy and national sovereignty in Europe, this is a great opportunity. And we've got to get behind these kind of populist revolts wherever they're occurring.
And you can say that the EU establishment, the EU elites, the people who are here in the Brussels bubble have sort of lost touch with the people that they're supposed to be representing.
Yes. And really what's happening is, I think, they always try and say, oh, this is just very superficial. Every time there's an election goes their way, they say, oh, thank God populism is dead and the adults are back in the room. They're ignoring the fact this is a very fundamental divide. We've really got two Europes we're talking about here. And that divide is really written into the EU, right into its founding documents, where they talked about founding a supranational bodies that would organise Europe, trying to remove power in Europe from the people as far as possible because they know what's best. That's kind of built into these institutions. And now that divide is kind of bursting into the surface, and you can see it. Policies like mass migration, the Green Deal, which threatens to impoverish and make miserable the lives of ordinary Europeans, are really is a kind of physical manifestation of that divide. So, and the farmers' protests, across Europe, are also an indication of how this is a Europe-wide phenomenon. Although there are national differences, it's not a coincidence that this kind of populist backlash is happening right across Europe. Even in the kind of bastions of socialism and social democracy like the Netherlands and Portugal, people have had enough. And it's a very exciting time.
And we could see a sort of shift in the European Parliament, the way it's set up as well, isn't it? Don't we?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as our friends the farmers would say, don't count your chickens before they're hatched, when we wait to see the results. But all the indications are that there's going to be a shift in the European Parliament. and that is going to change the political atmosphere in Brussels, and we've got to do everything we can to encourage that. I think Conservatives have too often been afraid of democracy, and worried about empowering the people too much. We've got to recognise that this is actually Conservatives' best hope now, is elections and referendums. That the other side, the woke elites, have captured the institutions of Europe, but we still have the chance to win the people over, and that's what makes the elections so important this time around.
Mick, thank you very much. Remaining on the subject of rising populism, Johan Dechman, a member of the Flemish Parliament for the right-wing Vlaams Belang party, talked to us about his party's chances in the Belgian elections in June, which are to be held on the same day as the European elections. Vlaams Belang is said to become the largest political force in Flanders, with 25-26% of the votes. Johan Dechman believes their popularity is down to two causes: immigration and security, which in many cases go hand in hand. As he said, Brussels had 9 shootings in the past few weeks in which several people were killed and which are related to drug trafficking. The police can no longer handle this, and in many neighbourhoods there is not even a police presence because they have become no-go zones. Johan Dechman said he would welcome the alliance of the two right-wing European groups in the European Parliament, ECR and ID, but he also understands that there are problems both between different countries and parties that do not make it possible at the moment. But, as he added, there is more that unites us than divides us. I think now it is time for a rise of the right and a return to traditional and conservative ideas. Johan Dechman also talked about the fact that there could be a majority of parties in the Flemish Parliament that are in favour of Flemish independence, and even though they would have the backing of the population, there would be many obstacles in their way. To find out why, read our interview on europeanconservative.com. Another party that has had enough of the Brussels establishment and its interference in domestic politics is left-wing nationalist party Smer, the party of Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico. Slovakia is potentially facing EU funds being withheld by the European Commission for so-called rule of law violations. But according to Katarina Neova, a member of the European Parliament for Fico's party Smer, the real reason behind the EU's punitive actions are the Slovak government's stance on a number of issues that deviate from the mainstream. Robert Fico has criticised pro-migration policies, EU federalisation attempts, transgenderism, the woke culture and sanctions against Russia, and has called for peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. As Katarina Neova told us, and I quote, "This is not a good way to do politics. It is not right for the Commission to interfere in domestic politics, especially with the European elections coming up. We are a pro-European party. We want to be a part of the European Union, but what is happening now is not right and not lawful." Katarina Neova calls the EU institutions politically biased, as they had no problem with the previous Slovak government investigating and prosecuting members of the opposition. Though her party, Smer's membership, was suspended by the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats group in the European Parliament due to Smer entering in a coalition with a right-wing nationalist party, Katarina Neova hopes they will be a member of the alliance once again after the elections. To find out more, read our interview on our website. And finally, Israeli physician, author and playwright, and brother of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Ido Netanyahu, gave an interview to the European Conservative this week in which he talked about, among other things, the ongoing war between Israel and the Palestinian terror group Hamas. Reflecting on decades of trying to achieve peace in the region, he said, and I quote, "What we got from the Palestinians after following the agenda of the peace movement and the Oslo Accords were suicide bombings which caused hundreds and hundreds of innocent people to die. And then we saw that what we got after we pulled completely out of Gaza, once again at the behest of the peace movement, was thousands upon thousands of rockets launched at our towns. Finally, we got the horrors of October 7. Ido Netanyahu said, alluding to the massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians by Hamas terrorists. He said peace can only be achieved in the Middle East through outstanding military strength and the willingness to use it, enabling the creation of a very powerful deterrence. Ido Netanyahu also talked about how Iran was behind the dangers Israel is facing and how the erosion of freedom of speech in the West originated in Israel. And that concludes this episode of Brussels and Beyond. Don't forget to read our magazine, check out our website, subscribe to our Twitter, Facebook and YouTube channels, and watch our monthly TV show Inside Brussels. Hope you tune in again next week. Have a very good week. Bye bye.